Welcome to the shop. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's video, I'm putting together Shisaki's Overhaul mask from My Hero Academia. Now, I've been watching a bunch of anime recently and reading a ton of manga, so my next couple of videos will be based on that subject matter. And if that's something that interests you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, this mask, of course, is made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and you can continue to support me and my channel by going through the links that are in the description section and those that are on my website. Now, this mask also has a free PDF file available on my website that you can download and build right along with me. I want to show you what it takes to put this mask together, so let's go ahead and get started. I created these custom templates by hand, but you can download them for free on my website. I'm going to take part A and transfer it onto some 6mm HD foam 2 times, making sure to also lightly mark the placement of the holes and part C. Now for the cut at the bottom of part A, it's going to transition from a 90-degree to a 45-degree cut in the front. This angled cut in the front will make a big difference later on when I attach part B to the bottom. All of the other cuts along the top and along the back are just a 90-degree straight cut. To begin the manipulation of the foam, I lightly hit it with a heat gun and I start to round over the top. These two surfaces are going to line up to give us the central seam for the mask. To glue the two part A halves together, I'm going to be using some weldwood contact cement. This adhesive is generously applied to the top seam only at this point and then left to dry. Once the contact cement has become tacky to the touch, it's time to put the two halves together. I like to start at the bottom and work my way up, making sure that this entire seam has been attached. And you can see having the 90-degree cuts at the top gives a curve to the mask. With the top assembled, now it's time to move on to the bottom, so I'm going to transfer part B onto some 6mm foam. Now I'm going to cut the sides of part B at a 45-degree angle. This is going to match up to the angles that I cut on the bottom of part A. Contact cement can now be applied to the bottom of part A and to the sides of part B. Now part B can be attached to the bottom of the mask, and you can see how the angles line up. Don't be afraid to squish the foam to make these transitions work, because the foam is a very forgiving material and the contact cement will hold fine. I'll work my way from the point of the beak up the sides until the bottom of the mask is completely attached. Now your seams that line up the sides here may not be perfect, and it doesn't really matter because we're going to cover them up with a piece later on, but I go ahead and take a smooth sanding drum and knock the seams down. This same smoothing process is also done to the central seam that runs down the center of the mask. Next, I go ahead and transfer the template for part C onto some 4mm foam. To get a nice organic curve to this cut, I go ahead and use my scalpel blade. Now my template looks a little bit different than the one on the downloadable PDF because I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this piece is going to work. This ridge is going to be an overlap section that glues onto the top of part A. So I start by marking the middle of this piece and gluing it to the center of the mask. Now Overhaul's mask has a prominent curve to the top, and to achieve this I'm going to put in some strips of 2mm HD foam. I glue this strip to the top first and then I attach the sides, but I make sure to squeeze the top of the mask in for the curve that I want. This small strip makes sure that the mask keeps this curve and it won't ever go flat. With that step complete, I can now attach the rest of part C to the outside of the mask. Now if this piece doesn't line up perfectly with the back, that's no problem. You can actually Dremel the two pieces flush. You'll also notice that the strip that goes along the bottom is a lot longer than it needs to be. Again, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this piece is going to work with the other ones that I've developed. A good portion of this will be cut off and sanded smooth to make way for part D. Now's the time that I round over all the edges on part C. I do this all along the front and the bottom, and if you have pieces along the back that aren't lining up properly, now's the time to go ahead and level those out. I go ahead and grab my custom template that I'd made for part D and see just how it's going to line up with the bottom of the mask. Once I'm satisfied with the fit, I go ahead and also transfer that onto some 4mm HD foam. Because I need to get some pretty intricate and straight cuts, I once again use my scalpel blade on this piece. I place part D along the bottom of the mask, lining it up with the two dots that I had transferred from the template earlier. So I go ahead and take my Dremel rotary tool and remove enough material for part D to set flush next to the mask. Now I don't want part C and D to line up perfectly, so there's a gradual slope to make it look like part D is on top. Marking where part D is going to sit on this mask with a pencil, I can now add some more Bob Smith superglue and pull this piece down into place. With the tip of the mask glued down, I can now work on the strip that goes along the top, making sure to line it up with the middle of the mask as best I can. Now in the manga version, his mask has some additional textures on it that aren't on the anime, but they looked really good, so I thought let's go ahead and put them in. To achieve these textures, I'm going to be doing the tinfoil technique by lightly heating up the phone with my heat gun and then pressing some tinfoil into the surface. This will subtly emboss the foam, but later on when I paint, these details will really stand out. At the bottom of the beak there's some additional foam that sticks past the metal part, so I just take my Dremel rotary tool and remove enough material until it's flush. I first mark out exactly how far I want the holes from the center of the mask. Now in the manga, the laces on the top are not straight across, they're actually at an angle. So I draw this angle all the way up the center of the mask to make sure that they're properly spaced out, and then I use a punch to make my starter holes. Once the holes were complete, I could then take my strips of 4mm foam and start punching them into the face of the mask with the back of a drill bit. Super glue is also added underneath and to the sides to make sure that these strips don't move. Now if you didn't want to go to all this trouble, you could also just glue these small strips directly to the top. Now once the center ridge of laces is complete, I go ahead and break out a 10mm hole punch to create the faux rivets for the front and the sides. This is kind of a fast forward, but unfortunately later on in the build I just was not happy with how these look, so I wanted to replace them with some 15mm rounds. And that's the great thing about foam, is that if you're not happy with something, you could just rip it off or try it again. Now I'm going to attach the little gears that go along the side, and not knowing exactly what size I wanted, I made 3 different patterns so I could decide later on. Now these patterns were cut out and then carefully traced onto some 2mm foam. Now you can see that I left the spikes on, but then clipped off the very tip of the edge just to give it that gear look. To create a more uniform look around the perimeter, I want to cauterize the foam, and I'm going to use my heat tool with a chisel bit. The heat tool is cranked to the highest temperature and then very lightly pressed into the foam. Now this was time consuming and tedious, but the overall effect I think turned out great. And remember, if you're going to be using a heat tool on foam, to always wear your respirator and work in a well ventilated area. Now the gears could be glued on with some Bob Smith super glue, and I lined them up with the middle of the dots that I had transferred from the pattern earlier. Now that the 4 gears have been glued on, I can start thinking about detailing the interior of them. And to do that, I'm going to be using the very end of a small sanding drum on my Dremel rotary tool. Now I use a Forstner bit to drill all the way through the gear and into the mask. If you don't have a Forstner bit, you could also just use a drill bit or use your heat tool to burn all the way through. For the stitches along the perimeter of the mask, I'm going to be using some micro suede that's been cut square. Now just like the stitches that I created for the center of the mask, I go ahead and sketch out the distance and placement for these holes. The punch is once again used to go all the way through the mask, and then I can start threading the micro suede through. The main thing here was to keep the micro suede from twisting. I wanted straight threads along the sides. Now I'm not saying that you can sew all types of foams that are out there, but my HD foam takes it like a champ. When I got to this point, I realized that I had one too many threads along the center, so I used my scalpel blade to remove one of them and then just continued the threading process. Part E consists of the pieces that will attach the elastic to the mask. This template is also transferred onto some 4mm HD foam. After being cut out, I sketch along the perimeter just a little ways in. I then follow this line with my scalpel blade, slightly scoring the surface. This is going to create a ridge detail that I'm going to open up with my heat gun. And just like the main section of the beak, some tinfoil is used to give these pieces some additional texture. I also sanded the edges using my rotary tool before these were glued into place on either side using some Bob Smith super glue. I used a 5mm hole punch on some 2mm foam to create the small faux rivets for either side. Now if you didn't have a hole punch, you could also use some googly eyes. It's time to seal and paint the mask, and my first step is going to be apply 2 light coats of Plasti Dip over the entire surface. After the Plasti Dip had been allowed to cure, I'm going to lay down my base color. It's Krylon Red Oxide Ultra Flat Primer. It's great for the majority of the mask while also making the gold color appear richer. I'm going to start by applying a wash to the entire surface, and I'm going to use some Liquitex Mars Black. This wash is going to consist of a lot of water, so I'm going to use my 1-inch mop brush. I'm going to apply the Mars Black wash all over the entire surface, and I'm going to dab away some of it with a wet paper towel. This is getting color all down into the details while also prepping the surface for additional paint. A hairdryer can also always be used on acrylics to speed up the dry time and lock in your layer. Next I switch over to a smaller filbert brush, but I'm using the same Mars Black. This time though, I'm adding less water and more pigment. This color is going to be applied all along the perimeter of the mask, making sure to get it down into all of the stitching details. Now I can go around all the gears and the stitching in the middle. This will start laying down all the shadows for the mask. The highlight for the main section of the mask is going to consist of Liquitex cadmium-free red medium. With this paint, I'm not adding any water, it's a complete dry brush onto the surface. And actually at this time I'm trying to make sure not to get it down into all of the details. I want some of those blacks that have already been laid down to show through. So here I'm applying second layer and third layer, and when you're applying a paint with no water to it, you want to start in the highlight area and then feather it out. And once you get really good with the nuances of hand painting, you can almost make this paint look as though it's airbrushed. For the gold sections on this mask, I'm going to be using Golden Brand Iridescent Bronze. This is a high pigment metallic paint that requires no water, so it's carefully applied to the gears. You want to make sure not to get it onto the matte colors that you've already laid down. For these larger metallic sections, I do add a little bit of water to the paint because I want to move the paint around, but I still want some of that red to show through. This is just a first pass for these areas, so while I allow that to dry, I go ahead and paint the faux rivets on the ends. Before I forget, the cadmium red was also applied to the bottom of the mask as well. For the second pass on the metallics, no water is added to the iridescent bronze. And here I'm not covering the entire surface, I'm selecting certain areas that I feel would have a highlight. Mainly that's going to be on open sections on the beak and on the rivets and around the perimeter. For the base color on the stitches, I'm going to be using a combination of Liquitex Heavy Body Bronze Yellow, Unbleached Titanium, and Mars Black. This paint mixture is applied with a small detail brush to the laces in the center, making sure not to get it down into the black areas. Just like the red sections, I'm trying not to completely cover the black that's underneath, so 2 light coats of this pigment were all I needed. This same mixture was also applied to the smaller stitches along the perimeter. And because the laces actually do go through the mask, I had to pull out one of my really tiny miniature painting detail brushes to make sure paint went all the way down into the crevice. To create the highlight for all the laces, I use the same color, but I add some more unbleached titanium to the mixture. This paint is diluted with a little more water than before, but is applied directly to the middle of all the threads, and this really makes them pop. To attach this mask to my face, I'm going to be using some 3/4 inch elastic straps. These elastic straps are hot glued and super glued to the back of part E. Now I found for my head the top strap needed to be about 16 inches and the lower strap needed to be about 12 inches. Just to secure these straps a little bit more, I take my templates that I had done for part E and transfer them again onto some 2mm foam. I then cut in about 1/4 inch all the way around and then glue this on top of the straps on the interior of part E. This will make sure that these straps don't ever pull away from the mask. I also decided to add an additional strip of 2mm foam to the interior of the nose section. This piece is mainly for comfort, but it's also an additional reinforcement for the top of the mask. So you can see the steps that I took to put together Shisaki's mask from My Hero Academia. Now remember, the templates for this are absolutely free and available over on my website, so be sure to download those and build right along with the video. And if you are building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best HD foam.